Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Cheryl Ann, and I'm the Executive Minister for Antler River Watershed, Western Ontario Waterways, and Horseshoe Falls Regional Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our gathering this afternoon. This event was originally planned to be an in-person event when our regional councils gathered together last spring. But like so many other events, it was first postponed and then adapted. We're deeply grateful to His Honor's flexibility and adaptability as we've changed plans. The idea for inviting the Honorable Murray Sinclair to speak to our regional councils is rooted in one of the key values we've embraced, to seek reconciliation. And we are grateful for this time with him now. I'm going to outline how we'll spend the next hour together so you will know what's happening. Pratima, will you pull up the slideshow, please?
Absolutely.
So we're together for 1 hour. This is the greeting and welcome. We will acknowledge the territory, speak of self-care, as this is a topic that can be a trigger for some, be led in prayer, and then we'll have the presentation by His Honor, followed by a question and answer period. We're going to ask you to hold your questions till that time, if at all possible, and then private message them to the questions name in the chat box. I'll go over that again for you. And then we'll have a thank you. There's a small break, and later on, there is a time for His Honor to have a fireside chat with representatives from the Indigenous ministries within our regional councils. Next slide, please, Pratima. We're going to use the chat box today, but in a limited way. We don't want to fill it with commentary or questions that end up being distracting during the presentation. If at any point you're having technical difficulties, then please private message Pratima out of the chat box at tech support. When we have time for questions, we'd ask that you message them to questions, which is where Therese Samuel of our staff will receive them and moderate them. If at any time you need pastoral care, we have 3 of our team available to you. Diane Matheson-Umanis, who will be at Care Diane, Marcy Gibson, who's at Care Marcy, and Kevin Steeper, who's at Care Kevin. We know that some people will be joining us today on the telephone. So when we reach the question time so that they can participate as well, we'll do a brief reminder, but you may recall at that point, if you do *9, then Therese will know that you're ready to ask a question, and *6 will unmute you. Because many of our communities have very limited bandwidth with rural internet, we're going to ask everybody now if you would please turn off your microphone and your video, unless you're someone who's presenting. And we look forward to this time together, and more importantly, to what this time together might spark for us to do after today. I pass it over to my colleague, Therese, who's going to lead us in the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Cheryl Ann. And I'm Therese Samuel. I am the Minister for Right Relations and Social Justice for the 3 regions of Antler River Watershed, Western Ontario Waterways, and Horseshoe Falls. I am a non-Indigenous settler of color, and I am speaking to you from the Chippewas of Saugeen Ojibwe territory, and land that is included in Treaty 18 of 1818. And so let us acknowledge the territory where we are now. Wherever we are in Ontario and in Canada, on Turtle Island, We are on land that since before the arrival of European settlers has been home to Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. We lament that, among other things, the nation we now call Canada was built on colonization and broken promises and stolen land. Homes and churches, farms, towns, and cities have been built and are still being built on stolen land. And we are here today to be part of righting wrongs that happened a long time ago and that are still happening now. Some of us here represent Indigenous peoples who have been on this land from time immemorial. Others of our families arrived as settlers, or we came, or our family came as my family came through settler immigration policies. We are settlers on this land. And all of us together have our own part in building new relationships between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous settlers. And this begins with honoring the land and our relationships on the land. So take a moment, breathe in and out, and give thanks for the land where you are now, and for the first peoples of this land, for the ancestors known and unknown, and the Indigenous peoples who are here now. And now I invite you to acknowledge, and you can also type this in the chat box if you wish, acknowledge what you know of who the Indigenous peoples are whose traditional territory is the land where you are now. And if you know it, you may include treaties or proclamations as well. You may not know. In fact, for some of you, this may be the first time that you are being asked to make such an acknowledgement yourself. If you don't know specifically, you can say with assurance that you are on land that is ancestral territory of Indigenous peoples who you do not yet know. And if you don't know, I encourage you to commit yourself to finding out. My colleague, Diane Matheson Jimenez, will put some resources in the chat that you can copy and use. The second thing to state for yourself, and you can also put this in the chat box if you wish, is a statement of your commitment. Commitment to be part of building right relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this land. And it may even be a specific thing that you plan to do. And may we all be part of bringing true healing, true justice, and truly right relations. And I invite my colleague who shares the social justice portfolio in the three regions with me, Diane Matheson Jimenez, to share with folks what her role will be here.
Thank you, Therese. Good afternoon, friends. My name is Diane Matheson Jimenez. I use she, her pronouns, and along with Therese, it is my great privilege to serve as a Minister for Social Justice to Antler River Watershed, Horseshoe Falls, and Western Ontario Waterways. I've had the great privilege to a few times now hear the Honorable Murray Sinclair speak, and I know that he is going to engage us this afternoon with good humor and that we're going to learn a great deal. And I'm mindful too that the topics that we're going to touch on are heavy topics and that there's the potential for that to stir up some difficult feelings for folks. So not if, but when that happens, I would remind you to take care of yourself, to do what you need to do to tend your spirit. If that means stepping away for a moment to make yourself a warm drink or shutting off the sound and taking some deep breaths, do that. And when the call has ended, set up a Zoom call with someone who you love, have a snuggle with your beloved pet. Whether it's raining or not, go outside and feel the hum of the earth under your feet and feel embraced by all of creation. If you feel that some of the things that are touched on today are things that you need to unpack further, there's 3 of us today who are available to provide some extra care and support to you. So I'm going to drop some contact information into the chat. Please reach out at any time during the call today to those of us who have care in front of our names. So that's myself, Marcy Gibson, and Kevin Steeper. After the event has ended, if you need some care, please reach out to one of the 3 of us so that we can support you in this work. It is now my great privilege to introduce to you someone who needs no introduction. Joyce Johnston is the minister at Cape Croker, and Joyce is here this afternoon to offer us a word of grounding prayer. Thank you, Joyce, for your presence today.
Thank you very much. So to begin, great mystery creator, God of us all, we address you in grateful hearts and gratitude for all your many gifts of creation, many that nurture and sustain all of your people. Grateful we are for the relationships of family, friends, and the many who support and care for us. We are especially grateful for the blessing of parents and those who provide care for our children. We acknowledge the blessing of each other who have gathered here this afternoon, especially the privilege of a good visit with Honorable Murray Sinclair. Help us not only to enjoy this time, but to listen and to speak respectfully and with truth and kindness. We ask for your blessings on all the people of Turtle Island and the lands beyond, that we may grow into a people who value each other and that respect our differences. Creator God, we humbly ask that you continue to be our guide throughout the course of our lives. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you, Joyce, for your leadership. It's my privilege to introduce His Honor Murray Sinclair to us. He has many different titles and is often referred to in conversation by some of those other titles by which he's known. For example, some of us may be familiar with calling him Justice Sinclair, which is a tribute to his more than 25 years in the Manitoba justice system, where he served as the first Indigenous justice in that province and only the second Indigenous justice in Canada. There are others among us who might say Commissioner Sinclair is with us today in recognition of his role as Chief Commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Along with Chief Littlechild and Dr. Wilson, His honor heard the heartache of residential school survivors and their families, and he helped prepare the report to set us on a path for reconciliation. Now, there might be others among us who say that today we're joining with Senator Sinclair in honor of his service in the Canadian Senate. And then there are some among us who are graduates from Queen's University who might be today referring to him as Chancellor Sinclair, one of his newer roles. So it's understandable that when I met with him to prepare for today, I asked him his official title, and he explained that we could call him His Honor or just Murray. And that reveals so much about who he is. His Honor spoke to United Church leaders when we attended the Edmonton session of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He grounded the words he offered us in his own life experience. I also have frequently heard him make affectionate references to his family when he's doing presentations. Who he is as an Indigenous man, as a husband, as a father, informs who he is as a justice, a commissioner, a senator, and a chancellor. He integrates his identity with the roles in which he serves, and in doing so, he inspires us and he challenges us to do the same. Murray, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today.
Well, miigwech for that very kind introduction. I very rarely get to hear one that's so personalized, and thank you for that. Sometimes I have to sit and endure listening to people read my biography, and when I wrote it, I was pretty excited at what we wrote, but now that I've listened to it about 438 times, it's pretty boring to me. So I appreciate when you make the effort to personalize it in that way. So thank you. That was very kind of you, very kind words. I want to acknowledge the opening prayer. Joyce, thank you for that. And thank you for being here with us and sharing those thoughts and those words. I also want to just for a moment reach out and acknowledge all of the residential school survivors and the members of their family who may be listening in, because residential school survivors and the family members are still there. Many of the survivors, of course, are getting older, getting later in life, as am I. But nonetheless, they still live with the memories of their experiences, good and bad. And I just want to acknowledge them and thank them for the help that they gave us during the course of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for sharing their stories, but also for sharing their words with their communities. And in particular, I also want to reach out to all of the children and the grandchildren of the residential school survivors, because they're the ones now who are living with the legacy of residential schools, and their big question in life is, it used to be, why are things the way they are? But now their question is, why do things have to continue to be the way they are? And so that's what we're going to talk about today, the issue of reconciliation. But let me begin my remarks by addressing an issue that I've probably gotten about 25 phone calls about this morning, including a number of requests to do TV interviews, all of which I've declined, having to do with the discovery of the graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. They estimate, I think, about 250 grave sites for what they're assuming are residential school survivors, or residential school children, rather, are buried. I don't know that they can make that conclusion this early, but nonetheless, we know from the stories of those who testified during the Kamloops Residential School hearings, as well as from the hearings at other schools, that at virtually every school there was a grave cemetery, grave sites where people who died at the school were buried, and the death rates within the schools were quite high. You had a greater chance of dying in residential school as a student there than the soldiers who went to war for Canada had fighting in the war. So, and that's a statistical fact that we pointed out in our report for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The death rates were that high, and deaths were attributable not just to any injuries the children may have sustained, but also attributable to the disease, illnesses, lack of medical treatment, and in some cases, suicides. So I want to, though, acknowledge the family members of those children whose grave sites have now been discovered, and I understand there's a process underway to try to identify them and make a connection to their families, and my heart goes out to them. We estimated, well, based on the information we were able to gather, we had information of about 6,000 children who died in residential schools. We had provable evidence that 6,000 died in the residential schools, but our estimates were that probably anywhere between 10 and 20% of the children who went to residential schools died either at the school or shortly after leaving the schools because of something that happened within the schools. And there was only one study that was ever done into that question. And that study concluded that at 7 residential schools in Saskatchewan, somewhere between 25 and 50% of the children at residential schools died while they were there or within months of leaving the schools, because often the children would be sent home to die if they had an illness that they couldn't be treated for at the school, and they often did die at the school. The spread of tuberculosis, for example, among First Nations communities in the 1940s and 1930s was largely attributable to the fact that tuberculosis was brought home from the schools by the children who were being sent home. And so they also contributed to the tremendous death rates from that particular disease in that period of time. So I'm sure that this information that's being discussed now in the national media is creating some consternation among residential school survivors and their family members. And I hope that they're able to come to terms with it and exercise some patience to find out more and be able to come to some conclusion about what that information is actually telling them. But at this point in time, it's not unknown information. It's one that we came about during the TRC process. So that sort of leads us into a question about how do you get over something like that? How do you come to terms with those kinds of events, deaths in the schools, kind of abuse that children experience, but not only that, just the fact of separation, the fact of indoctrination into another culture, the fact of prohibition from speaking your language, prohibition from practicing your culture, in some cases, prohibition from seeing your mothers, your fathers for your entire school life, and losing your ability to function back in your home communities because the skill of hunting, fishing, trapping was taken away from you while you're in schools. The attempt to ensure that children in the schools were given basic skills in housekeeping and in farm work, but no basic skills on how to actually do career type professional work, such as working as carpenters, working as machinists, working in any of the career fields that it was becoming very popular to train people to do. Canada had one of the highest rates of young men going to war between certain age groups, and Indigenous men signed up to go to war, largely because they wanted to get away from the residential school experience, and they wanted to actually learn a trade while in the army. And in addition to that, the elders of many communities said that when they signed the treaties with the Crown, that they promised the Crown that when the Crown needed them to fight for the Crown, to fight for the nation, that they would step up and do that. And so they did that. Some communities, 100% of the men went to war and signed up as soldiers. And that created its own set of trauma as well, because many who went to war were traumatized by that experience. And when they came back, government of Canada denied them any benefits to get counseling or to get help. Veterans benefits, which were paid to non-Indigenous veterans, were denied to Indigenous veterans because the government said that they'd have to go to the Department of Indian Affairs to get any medical services under the treaties. And in many cases, as a result, they had no veterans benefits whatsoever. I know that because my father's friends who went to war with him were denied benefits. He was not, because my grandfather had signed him out of the Indian Act when he was a young boy, but still all of the friends that my grandfather's connections, all of the children, all of the young men in particular who went to war from those families, were denied veterans benefits after their experience in the war. Tommy Prince is probably one of the best examples of that. Canada's most decorated war veteran had to threaten to go to court in order to get some benefits, but he was still denied benefits through the Veterans Affairs Department. He had to get his benefits through the Department of Indian Affairs. One of the things that raises was just the uneven treatment, the unequal treatment, the lack of civil treatment that Indigenous people experienced over the years. And that was a deliberate act on the part of the government of Canada, going back to the period of time leading up to Confederation. Canada had developed into a pretty racist state by the time of Confederation, so that those who took office when Canada became an independent nation were of the view that Indigenous people were uncivilized, were heathens, were pagans, that they were inferior people, and that their children could not be educated because they were not as mentally capable as the non-Indigenous children. So the public schools that were created, for example, in the colonies around the time of Confederation, denied Indigenous children the same education that they were providing to the non-Indigenous children. They denied that to the Indigenous children because they felt that they were incapable of understanding that education. And on top of that, they felt that that particular population of people, the Indigenous kids, shouldn't be occupying positions of privilege within society, such as becoming doctors and lawyers and politicians, that they should be the ones who do the menial labor that supports the privileged within society. So the public school system that was created, and this goes back to Egerton Ryerson's report in the 1850s, and that was supported by Sir John A. Macdonald and other politicians in the various colonies at the time of Confederation. The public school system that was created did not provide the same, or in some cases, any access to education, particularly in First Nations communities. Instead, Ryerson had recommended that children should be educated, Indigenous children should be educated in what he called training schools or industrial schools, to learn menial labor, to learn those skills that were necessary to allow the machines to function, to clear the land, to do the tasks that were essential for the industrial world to be able to function, but that they would not be trained or educated to be those who headed the industry. So they were not given any skills on how to manage corporations or manage businesses or learn about law or learn about medicine. And so as a result, the education that was intended to be put into the industrial school model, which led into the residential schools, was essentially an education on how to do menial labor type of work. And so when you look at the residential schools that were established in the 1880s by the government of Canada, you can see that Sir John A. Macdonald's philosophy that we cannot educate Indigenous children, or Indians as he called them, Indian children, to do the same work that the non-Indian children are doing because they're not capable of doing it. Instead, we need to take them away from their families and put them into residential schools so that we can give them some basic reading and writing skills. Otherwise, if they stay at home and we educate them at home, they will be going back home each night and will be rendered or continue to be heathens and savages, just like their parents. And at the end of the day, we will end up with heathens and savages who can read and write. And he said that's not acceptable. So that's why they established the industrial school model, and that led directly into the residential schools. The reason he said that, incidentally, is because after Confederation, when Canada was expanding into the West, there was a requirement imposed upon Canada by the Crown in England, which was the entity that had to give permission to Canada to expand, that Canada could only expand into the West if they entered into treaties with the First Nations people who were there. That was a provision that was in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, a promise the Crown had given to the Indigenous leaders as far back as that, about 110 years earlier. And so the government of Canada was required by law to enter into those treaties. And it was also made a condition of the transfer and purchase of Rupert's land into the control of the Dominion of Canada, that all of the land that was covered by the Rupert's Land Grant, or the Hudson's Bay Grant, also was required by the government of England, or the Crown in England, that the government of Canada had to enter into treaties for all of the legal interests that they had in that territory. So Treaty Number 1 was negotiated in 1870. And Treaty Number 1 provided that Indians were giving up all the land in return for a very small pittance, very small payment. But the Indigenous leaders came to the negotiations armed with several demands, one of which was that they wanted schools placed in their communities so that their children could be as educated as the little white children. And so they insisted that before they signed the treaty, they wanted that provision in the treaty. And when you look at Treaty Number 1 and the subsequent treaties, you see, in fact, that there are references to that being a demand that was made. And some of the later treaties is actually in the treaty. But in Treaty Number 1, the government negotiators couldn't go back to Ottawa and rewrite the treaty. So instead, what they did was they promised that there would be another document signed, which was later signed. It was referred to as the outside promises. And in that document and in the subsequent treaties, the government promised to build schools on the reserves and to staff them and maintain them as and when the Indigenous leaders demanded them, and that they would ensure that the Indigenous children would be educated in those schools. But the government had no intention of doing that. Sir John A. Macdonald's philosophy was, we need to take the children away from their parents and put them in these residential schools so that they will be free from the influence of their parents and will not be savages who can read and write, to use his phrase. And so that became the approach the government took, even though there was a very clear promise in the treaties that they would build those schools. Most of the land in the West was not, in fact, never covered by treaty, particularly in places like British Columbia and in some parts of Alberta. But the government still insisted that they had the right to expand into the territory, and they did. And as they expanded, they started to establish these residential schools. And in the residential schools, you've heard of many stories of things that happened there. But from the outset, children were complaining about how they were being treated. And I used to wonder, even while I was in my early years of law school, why weren't the parents doing something about this? You know, if that were my child and I was learning that my children were being abused or were being denied access to their culture, being denied access to their language, I would do something about it. Why are the parents not doing something about it? And if you think about it, if your children were put into a school and they're being told, you can't do that, you can't speak your language, you can't practice your culture, you can't hang out with your brothers and sisters, you can't see your parents, you would do something about that. One of the things you would do would be to demonstrate. You might protest, walk up and down the streets with signs, and that's a popular way of showing your displeasure with government decisions. And so the government passed a law in the 1880s that said that any Indigenous person who left the reserve in order to engage in a protest against the government of Canada was committing an offense and could be punished for that, could be prosecuted and punished. And so public demonstrations and public gatherings were denied to Indigenous people. So one of their basic civil rights, the right to gather, the right to complain, was taken away from them. So if you can't do that, maybe you hire a lawyer and go to court. So the government attacked that in two ways. One is that they said you can't sue the government of Canada unless you get permission from the Department of Indian Affairs first. And the Department of Indian Affairs never gave permission to anybody to ever sue them. And on top of that, they said that any lawyer who gives legal advice or agrees to give legal advice to an Indigenous person was without permission from the Minister of Indian Affairs, who happened to be Sir John A. Macdonald. That lawyer would lose his right to practice law. And so access to justice was denied by those provisions. Well, if you can't participate in a public demonstration and you can't go to court, then maybe what you do is you vote them out of office. In 1885, most people don't know this, but in 1885, Sir John A. Macdonald's government, or the government of Canada, had passed an amendment to the Citizenship Act, which said that Indigenous people could vote in federal elections so long as they own property worth the value of £100. So if they own property outside of the reserve, they could exercise the right to vote. And so in the East, the Indigenous leaders got together and they voted out a member of parliament who didn't support them, and they voted in a member of parliament who supported them. And so Sir John A. Macdonald and his government was not happy with that. So in 1892, they amended the Citizenship Act that said that anybody who owns property worth the value, any male person who owns property worth the value of 100 pounds or more, has the right to vote except for an Indian. So they defined person to mean anybody other than an Indian. So that meant effective in 1892, the right to vote was taken away. And on top of that, in 1892, through that same law, which they interestingly called the Indian Advancement Act, they took away the right of Indigenous people to run their sovereign affairs. So that meant the right to their own internal governance was taken away from them. And that was contrary to the Royal Commission, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which said that the government, the Crown, would not interfere with the internal functioning of Indian tribes without their consent. And none of them had ever consented to that kind of interference. So from that point forward, the government effectively ran their internal affairs. Only chiefs and councillors elected under the new provisions of the Indian Act could be allowed to hold office. They had to give notice of any meeting they were going to have to the Indian agent. The Indian agent had the right to attend that meeting, and he had the right to chair that meeting, and he had the right to keep all of the records of that meeting in his office. So that's why most First Nations communities don't have any archival records of anything that they decided. But then, of course, on top of all of that, what happened to the children in the schools. And the children, of course, were taken away, separated from their families. And I often say, you know, just imagine what it would be like for you as a parent, if, or even as a grandparent, if your child or your grandchild were taken away from you for no good reason, other than the fact that the government didn't like the way that you were raising them, and placed in a residence somewhere outside of your control, denied you the right to visit them, denied you access to them, and you couldn't do anything about it. What would you think about that? How would you feel about that? What would that do to you? And what would that do to those children, many of whom were 5, 6, 7 years of age, and were obviously very lonely? And in the schools, there were rules that separated the brothers from the sisters. The schools that were run by the department required that the older siblings could not talk with the younger siblings. The result was, of course, that the children were damaged by that experience. And that occurred over a period of 125 years or so, until the last residential school was closed in 1996. And what that tells you is that for that whole period of time, generation after generation after generation of children went into that school, experienced life in the schools in that way, and then went back home, where their own internalized limitations from the school experience continued to hold them back and prevent them from functioning. And on top of that, while the intention of the school was to indoctrinate the children into another way of living so that they could be totally assimilated into Canada, and the intent was, of course, that their racial existence would be separate, would be eventually wiped out. They couldn't integrate into Canada because of the racism in Canada. And one of the reasons for that is that this whole idea about Indigenous children or Indigenous people being inferior to non-Indigenous people was taught in the public schools of our country. I went to public schools throughout my whole life, and that was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even in university. They taught us that Indigenous people were uncivilized, that they were warrior class, that they didn't maintain any sort of governance, they didn't have any laws, that they didn't have any sense of property, that they were mentally inferior to the more superior cultures of the European nations. I remember the debates we used to have in university was, Indian people don't look you in the eye because they know that they're of a lesser being. And so all of this was reinforced through our education system. And so what we have is a group of people who are being told that they're from inferior stock and that they have no rights, they have no history, they have no culture that's worth keeping, they have no ability or right to maintain their language, their right to territory was never really recognized in law, and therefore they didn't have the right to maintain and argued that they had those rights. And at the same time, you had this other group of children who were being told that they came from superior stock and that their people were more developed, that their people were more intelligent, their people were more privileged, their people had the right to do through the doctrine of discovery or the doctrine of terra nullius, whatever it was that they wanted to do. And so you had these groups of people, groups of students who were being educated in the very same way, but the impact upon their lives was totally different. And as a result, even I, as in the course of my education, and I was a very successful student. I got top marks and I was an athlete in school, and I was a valedictorian of my class. I got lots of scholarships to go to university when I graduated from high school. But even I suffered from the thought that somehow I had to overcome this past. I had to prove myself when others didn't have to prove themselves. And I remember I went back to one of my class reunions about 25 years after I graduated from high school, and I said, one of the very sad realities for me now is to recognize that back in the day when I was standing here before you and speaking as a valedictorian for our graduating class, none of you would ever have wanted me to be a really close friend to you. None of you would have wanted to come and stay at my house with me. None of you would have ever come to a birthday party that I might have invited you to, but we didn't invite children to our birthday parties because we couldn't afford, in many cases, to have those parties. My parents and my family members never had high school reunions, but your parents did all the time. And why is that? Why do we see our educational experiences as being so different? It's because we see it as a negative experience. That's why the high school dropout rates are so high as they are. And so the question becomes, how do you reconcile from all of that? How do you overcome that history? We talk about that in the TRC report, and those of you who are part of our national event know that we often raise that question. How do you reconcile from this long, painful history of oppression? And I've only given you a few examples. There's lots of things, the legal system, the medical system and the quality of treatment, the provincial resources system, all sorts of different ways. Indigenous people were always being constantly reminded that they were less than equal. The way they were treated in stores, the way they were treated in hotels, the way they were treated in public, the way people talked about them, the way people treated them or talked about them in the media, the way the movies portrayed us, the way the TV shows portrayed us. I remember reading a paper when I was doing some, I was on the faculty of graduate studies at the University of Manitoba, and a young student had prepared a paper as part of his master's work in which he entitled his chapter, Tonto saved the Lone Ranger's ass more often than the Lone Ranger saved his. And he had actually documented all the time that the Lone Ranger got into trouble and Tonto saved him from being killed. And yet that was never portrayed as a positive experience. It was like there was something about the Lone Ranger that just mysteriously allowed him to survive that very difficult situation. And yet it was, I met the fellow who portrayed Tonto in the shows many years later, and I said, "What was it like doing that show?" And he would say, "Some days," he said, "I couldn't go to work. I just, I didn't know what to do." He said, "I just couldn't go to work. I needed the money. I had a family." But he said, "I knew it was going to be an embarrassing day. I knew that my people didn't like the way that I was portraying them." And yet, he had his moments in the shows, but still very few and far between compared to the way things other work. But it was in the media, it was in comic books, it was in the storybooks, and the way that we were being portrayed was always as primitives, as people who were savages, as people who had no sense of right or wrong, and people who would kill children at a whim's notice. And as a result, growing up with that image in mind does something to you. It hurts you. It makes you want to get away from seeing it all the time. Dropout rates in school, as I said, for Indigenous kids are still well in excess of 80% in some schools. And the suicide rates among young Indigenous children is because they don't see any hope. They can't see themselves as being part of the future of this country. We're beginning to see change, of course. We're beginning to see more and more young Indigenous children who are advocating to become doctors and lawyers and engineers and other professional people. And many of them, of course, are working within churches such as yours. But at what cost? They want to know, at what cost do I have to pay in order to be a success at this? That's one of the tasks that I've given myself since retiring from the Senate, is to work with young Indigenous lawyers to help them to learn how to be the best lawyer that they can be by being the best Anishinaabe person that they can be. Because you don't have to give up your identity to be able to function in this world. What we need to also get Canadian society and the justice system in particular to understand is that they have not done enough to understand that there is, in fact, a system of laws in place for Indigenous people that need to be respected. I'm just looking at the timeline that I've got here to see if how much over it I am. I'm going to take a few more minutes and talk about issues that I think we need to think about as we go forward. Reconciliation generally, people want to know, what does it mean? Like, how do you define reconciliation? And sometimes people argue against reconciliation. I hear this often from young Indigenous people that say we can never have reconciliation because we never had a relationship of conciliation. We never had a good relationship from the outset. And that's not quite accurate. The relationship from the very beginning was in fact one of equals, one in which the colonizers and the settler population that was coming here was forced to recognize that they were living in a situation where Indigenous people dominated the relationship. But the Indigenous people were kind enough to let that, in Canada in particular, let that domination keep them, or let that domination, stop that domination from preventing them to do harm or bring about harm to non-Indigenous settlers. There's lots of stories of people like Chief Peguis, when the Lord Selkirk settlers first came to the Red River area, about how the Anishinaabe people in the Red River area helped them to survive for the first 3 years of their arrival, and helped them to adapt to this area, and helped other communities to establish themselves and welcome them and work with them. And there were instances of conflict, there's no question of that. But overall, the leadership on the Indigenous side and the non-Indigenous side worked together to try to overcome them and deal with them whenever they could. And at the time of Confederation, most people aren't even aware of the fact that at the time of Confederation, there were probably anywhere from 10 to 15 times as many Indigenous people in this country as there were non-Indigenous people. And so what we're looking at is the case of a small minority population of non-Indigenous people who were controlling the lives of the Indigenous population through legislation. And that's the definition of apartheid. They established an apartheid regime where they denied rights to Indigenous people, but gave themselves as much rights as they could at the expense of Indigenous territory, Indigenous people and Indigenous rights. And that's the very model of apartheid that was followed in South Africa. You know, we decry what happened in South Africa, but we don't do that for Canada. And yet we should. We should be more cognizant of that fact. But we need, in order to be able to move forward in reconciliation, we need to understand the truth of all of this. And so reconciliation is about coming to terms with all of these things in a way that allows us to be able to establish a relationship of mutual respect and mutual coexistence. And we have to accept that sometimes that coexistence is going to vary from place to place. In some places, it's going to be more of a sovereignty question. In other places, it'll be more of a partnership question. But nonetheless, it's about establishing a relationship based upon the situation that exists in that area at that time. I always tell people, though, that before we can get to a situation of mutual respect, we have to understand that Indigenous people have the right to a position of self-respect. They have the right to be able to gain their self-respect back. And that's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People recognizes, that one of the fundamental questions is the right of Indigenous people to their self-respect. And in addition to the mutual respect question, which is also addressed in the UN Declaration, the right to self-respect is also part of it. And in the TRC report, we talk about the importance of addressing those immediate issues through changes to the educational system, changes to the child welfare system, changes to the justice system, changes to the healthcare system, so that Indigenous people are not treated as second-class people. Excuse me. And so as a result, we need to understand that importance first. And sometimes we want to skip right to changing our relationship without recognizing that Indigenous people are still in the throes of coming to terms with their own victimization in this relationship in the past. We also need to ask ourselves, well, what role does forgiveness play in reconciliation? And my response to that is that we shouldn't make forgiveness a precondition to reconciliation, but we always need to think about where it's going to fit in a particular dialogue. You can't demand or ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness has to be freely given. And so you can certainly express remorse. And that's part of the dialogue on reconciliation that we need to recognize as important. But it is not asking for forgiveness. The conversation needs to lead perhaps to that on an individual basis. But I always tell people, you know, it's like we need to understand that institutions were largely responsible for some of this negativity. And it's hard to forgive an institution. It's like trying to forgive the car that runs you down. And you can't forgive a car. it is about whether or not you can forgive the driver. And if the driver is no longer here with us, then maybe forgiveness is more difficult, more challenging, maybe impossible. But it's still something that people need to think through before we go forward. One of the things that I also get asked is, why do we need reconciliation? Why don't we just get over it? I mean, everybody just get over it and let's move on. Well, you can't get over this. This is like asking people to get over the loss of life, the loss of children, the loss of those elements of life that contribute to your identity, contribute to who you are. You just can't get over that. You need to be able to rebuild that. You need to be able to fix that. And so usually it's the people who already have that well in place who are the ones to say, well, just get over it and let's move on. And I say to them, well, there's something in your life that you can't get over. And let's talk about that. You know, can you get over the fact that you lost people during the war? Can you get over the fact that people tried to kill you, kill your ancestors at one point in time? Can you get over the loss of life that occurred during 9/11 in New York? Can you get over some of these huge tragedies that we've all experienced? And the answer often is, well, we have to memorialize those things. And sometimes that's one way of being able to come to terms with it, is appropriate memorializations. But it's not about forgetting. It's about coming to terms with it. It's about figuring out where it goes in the relationship. And we also need to understand the importance of internalizing reconciliation too, because I speak to young Indigenous students at universities and high schools, in communities, at community events. And one of the things I tell them is that one of the things we have to figure out how to do is we have to figure out how to overcome the anger we feel at white society, because it's justifiable on the one hand, but it's harmful on the other. It's holding us back from living a life as full as we could live and as useful and as happy as we could be, because instead we're always looking for the bad in the other side, and sometimes it's not there. Sometimes things that would simply be accepted as inadvertent words or inadvertent actions, we attribute improper motives to it. And we need to figure out for ourselves how we can put ourselves back into balance. And that's one of the very fundamental teachings of most Indigenous societies, is learning how to be in balance with yourself, with creation, with others. And we haven't been able to do that. And coming to terms with your own history and being able to answer that question for yourself about, where do I come from? Where do my people come from? That's an important question. It's an important question that Christianity generally has denied access to, or even validity to, Indigenous people about. Where do my people come from? We have our own creation story as Anishinaabe people, but no one, when I was younger, no one ever allowed us to learn it, and no one ever encouraged us to discover it. And that was one of the sad features of my life, until I learned about how to go about finding the answer to that. And where do I come from? Where do my people come from? Who are my heroes? Who are the people who have contributed to who I am? I went to one event one time with an elder who spoke, and he sat down, and on a broad sheet of paper, he wrote down, you have two parents, and they each have two parents, and they each have two parents, and so that's only 3 generations. And if you go back even further, he said, within a very short period of time, you're into numbers that are astronomically high. He said, and if you think about your ancestors from 200 years ago, you're talking about almost 1 million people that have contributed to you. Their DNA is part of you. And so you're connected to those people. And if you're connected to those people, you owe them something because they gave you something. You don't owe it in the sense of a debt. You owe them in sense of you must live in accordance with what they gave to you. And so he said, you have a lot of work to do figuring that out. So, and that's about who we come from, where we come from, who we are. And for Indigenous kids in residential schools, we were denied access to that knowledge. And we know that. Without reconciliation, there will never be trust. It's that simple. And as long as we don't have trust, our conversations are always going to be about blame. And so we need to figure out how reconciliation is going to occur so that we can trust each other. If a relationship of mutual trust, mutual respect is going to be created, we got to figure out how to get there. And one of the most difficult parts of that still continues around us today. And that's the whole question of genocide, reconciliation and genocide. Because, genocide is not just about murdering people. It is about that. But genocide is about attempting to annihilate a race of people from their race. You can still allow them to live, but you deny them access to their racial identity, to their history, to their sense of being, their sense of self. It's right in the Convention on Genocide. There are different ways of committing genocide in addition to attempting to physically wipe people out. It's also about removing children from one cultural group forcibly and placing them with another racial or cultural group for the purpose of eliminating the race that they came from. And Sir John A. Macdonald enunciated this, and many after him did as well, that the purpose of residential schools is so that there will no longer be Indians in the future, and we don't have to worry about them claiming rights. Even Pierre Elliott Trudeau said that, and he wasn't even aware that he was uttering words of cultural genocide. He said, among other things, he said, why should we worry about you speaking your language when you don't even speak it? That if you're serious about speaking your language, then speak it. And so by doing that, he actually ignited the language recovery movement. But he was also saying that we don't care if you don't care. And they should care because they're the ones who eliminated it to begin with. There are lots of other things I could talk about, but I don't have enough time for everything. So I'm going to try to give you some time for the Q&A and for the Elders Council. So I will cut it off there. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this presentation and be part of your day. I hope that I've assisted you in your dialogue and in your thinking for the future. Thank you very much.
Murray, thank you. We have an official thank you, but I want to check time with you and what works for your schedule. We are close to time. Could we maybe do a couple of questions, do our official thank you, and then we would like to have a prayer in remembrance of the 218 graves found today, and then a break in the fireside chat. Does that work for you?
Yeah, I told everybody the moment I turned 70, I started reversing my age. So I'm actually getting younger each day. So yeah, I got lots of time.
If you can bottle that, a lot of us would buy it.
Oh no, it's not for sale. I assure you. You got to figure it out for yourself, okay?
I will pass it over to Therese for a couple of questions, and then we'll do our formal closing so you can have a break before we meet with our for our fireside chat.
All right.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about, and we have a little bit of time for questions. What I invite you to do is to private message your questions to me. I don't see any questions yet, and I will.
Oh, good.
That.
Good. Longer break before the fireside. Okay.
And a number of people expressing their thanks for your wise and insightful words and your wisdom and truth. And it might be that that we need to just sit and.
I will share a little
Sure.
story while other people are thinking about questions, and that is the latest title I have to bear now is Chancellor at Queen's University. And when I announced to the family that I was accepting the appointment, my granddaughter said, so what is it that you're going to be doing? And so I explained some of the duties, and she said, so what do they call that? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, you know, when you're a judge, then you're judging. When you're a lawyer, you're lawyering. But when you're a chancellor, are you chancelloring? Are you chancellating? Are you chancelizing? Well, you can figure out the term, but yeah. So she's working on trying to figure out what the term is that I'm going to be doing.
So I have got a few questions that are just pouring in now.
Okay.
And one question was about the origin of the term Indian, and has it always been offensive?
Has it always been offensive? I can't speak to always. I can speak to within my lifetime. And I can say that probably it has grown in among Indigenous people. It has grown in unpopularity in the last 50 years. When I started attending university, I think the more scholarly of us who were in university were trying to figure out whether that was a term that we should try to use. And for a while, we went through a kind of a genesis of terminology. For a while, Native seemed to be pretty popular as a term. And you may remember that for a period of time, people who used to be called Indians would be referred to as Native people. And that seemed to be more acceptable because it referred to people who were sort of naturally here before others. But then that sort of lost its attraction. And then we went to the term Aboriginal, which literally means from the original people, so Aborigines in Australia, where the term is used to refer to the original people of Australia. It's a combination of the word ab in Latin, which means from, and origin is from the original people. So we are the descendants of the original people, so we are Aboriginal. So that was a term that was kind of more popular probably until the early part of this century, beginning in the early 2000s, mainly through the efforts of the United Nations, I think, and the dialogue around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They established a committee to look at the UN Declaration, and they referred to it as the Indigenous Peoples Committee. And it seems to have been better received than anything to this point in time. So So the term Indians wasn't always as unpopular as it has become, but it certainly, from among Indigenous people, it probably wasn't a popular term. It was more popular among non-Indigenous people, and that's true for most of these terms. But for Indigenous people, I think their influences has become to the point now where they're trying to struggle with whether or not even Indigenous is the right word, or whether we should be insisting that we be referred to by our tribal name. So Anishinaabe for us, and other tribes are starting to put forward the argument that they should be allowed to be referred to as in accordance with their own term for themselves. So.
And another question that in various ways has been coming up, and I think this will probably be the last question, were questions around how can we as church, and I think probably that as settler church, best be allies. And in particular, there was a question about working with our youth in the settler church. How have you got some things? They asked for 3 things, but even we'd be happy with one thing that we can do to help the next generation.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments about that. So let me, probably the most important thing is to recognize that you have a role to play, the churches have a role to play, or a particular church like the United Church has a role to play in reconciliation by ensuring that members of your congregations are properly educated about this history, about what this is all about, and ensuring that you support appropriate education for children in public schools and children in public and in the media, so that you have significant influence in modern society. And you should use that influence to advocate for change, to ensure that people are made aware of and become familiar with the story about residential schools, while also acknowledging the role that the church has played, because United Church ran a number of residential schools, of course. But you know, the United Church was one of the first to issue apologies for its role, and I would say that during the term of the TRC, the United Church was one of the leaders in terms of advocating for the TRC, advocating for public support for understanding around the residential school experiences, and encouraging members of congregations to participate, to attend, to show support, emotional support, friendship support, and things such as that. So I think there's a role to play within the church that you need to have as a primary focus, and that is educate your congregations, educate your members, educate yourselves, so that the next generation of United Church leaders, next generation of United Church members are fully immersed in this story and aware of it, so that they can continue the advocacy that's needed in society generally, because it's institutions like churches, and the United Churches is one of the leaders in this field, that will ensure that this is a part of the history that we do not forget. And so one of the temptations would be to try to fix people, to try to fix Indigenous people. And I think that to the extent that they seek it from you because they're either members of the congregations that you're involved with, or they're members of the church, or they're part of what it is that whatever services you're providing, feel free to do that. But I don't think that there's a role to play for institutions generally to be the ones to say that, this is how we fix it, because Indigenous people have to be an important part of that conversation as well. So there were a couple of points in there I hope that people were able to discern, but understanding this history and then advocating within the church to ensure that people are fully informed, and then recognizing the limitation that you inherently have because it's a non-Indigenous institution is also very important. But also be there when called upon. That's probably the third point. Just be there when called upon. And you will be called upon from time to time for help, for support, just to show up and indicate that this is a broad-based question that we're trying to fix here.
Thank you. Those answers have been very helpful to our next steps forward. And I see that there have been many more questions in the chat. And I assure you that we will retain those questions. And the next step from this event, folks, is for us to have another gathering to say, now what? And so your questions will be part of what we use for that. So thank you for sharing your questions. And thank you, Your Honor, for sharing your time and your wisdom and your stories.
Thank you.
And I turn it over to Cheryl Ann.
I'll actually turn it over to Fred Monteith for our thank you. And then Fred, you could pass it back to me.
Your Honor, Murray, thank you for reminding those of us who identify as settlers about the unsettling truth of our history. Thank you for reminding us that we all have a lot of work to do and that there are questions that we need to live for the moment rather than answer. Thank you for reminding us, as you have before, that there are no shortcuts, that when it comes to truth and reconciliation, we are forced to go the distance. Magwitch, Dewa, Mercy, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Fred. One of our members reminded us that when His Honor opened, he opened with the words reminding us about the graves found, cautioned us that we don't have a lot of information yet. But what we do know is that these represent 218 individuals whose graves were not marked and whose resting places were not honored. And that they serve as a reminder to us that that's true for many children who attended Indigenous schools, some of which we operated. It seems appropriate for us out of our tradition to mark this moment with prayer. So I invite you to join me in prayer. Creator of God, giver of life, we give thanks for these 218 lives. We wonder who they were, what joys they discovered, what laughter they knew, what heartaches they suffered. And we give them now into your keeping for who these 218 people were. Their unmarked graves remind us that there are so many other residential school children whose resting places have not been marked, whose lives were stolen in myriad ways through the residential school experience, and that the church we love and serve was part of that troubling history. So we confess and repent. We know that racism continues. This is not an old story, but a very present fact. And we could list off data today that would demonstrate how pervasive it still is and how complicit we are in those systems every time we do not acknowledge them or seek to change them. So we ask now that you will be with us as we go forth, that your gift of peace and your promise of renewal may rest upon all who experienced residential school or whose families were impacted by it, and that your call may be upon us to reconcile and make new. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.